Am I live? Can you guys hear me? Let me see the YouTube. Let's see the YouTube. Yep, it seems to be working. So there's a. Yep, it seems to be working. Okay, so assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد. Okay, so before we start, I'm going to put my Canva over here. And the task of today's session is not to dive really into any of the works of Imam Al Ghazali, because I don't believe we would have enough time to go into any of them in any sort of detail. We might skim over some of them and give some of the context and talk about their impact. But apart from that, I do not believe that we can go into the works of Imam Al Ghazali in this video. So the way that this is going to be structured is that I'm going to do a presentation. The presentation is probably going to take 30 to 40 minutes. And then after the presentation, we will have question and answers. And whichever questions you guys want to ask, you can ask them. And we will see if this format suits us or not. And if it doesn't, we can move on to Google Meet, inshallah, if this does not work, right? So this is the first session of the Imam Al Ghazali reading club. So this is going to be an introduction into the life. I'm largely going to take you through his life, not in some relative detail, but just to give you an overview of what his life was, the context of his times, the way that he lived, the books that he wrote, the different, let's say, periods of his life. And after I've done that, then from the next session on, what we can do is that we can start by Al-Maqsad Al-Asna. We will go through some of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that session. And then we can, in the next session, we would go to Arba'in fi Usuluddin. The reason I'm going to do 2 books is because I don't want you guys to get bored. And I want to make the conversation, let's say, more so lively. And because we could do 1 work at a time, but I think that would get a bit boring. So what we would do is that we would do 2 works at a time, right? So I believe without further ado, let's wait a couple of seconds to see if, let's say, some other people join or not. And then we can start, inshallah ta'ala. So I'm not going to go into much details regarding, like, let's say, the views of Imam Al Ghazali in this presentation. And the reason for that is that let us just go through his life in this session. Let us go through the context of his times. There may be some things that would be a bit complex, but I think they should be known. So such as like what was going on in the Muslim world at the time before Imam Ghazali was born, what kind of ideologies were going there, and I will just explain them in brief. So, and this would not be a detailed, let's say, presentation into the beliefs of the time. And so I guess we have 11 people, so we can start and then others can join. So what we're going to do is that we're going to go to the full mode on. And yeah, I think this is, can you guys see the entire screen? Let me see on my phone if it's working. Yep, that looks, yep, looks great. So now, a thing about Imam Al Ghazali is that Imam Al Ghazali does not come from a vacuum of scholarship. So Imam Al Ghazali comes from an entire tradition of scholarship in which, why is this showing up? So let us begin. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So during the early period, so Imam Ghazali is right after what we would define as the early period of Islam. So the early period would be what you would conventionally call the period of the Salaf. So the Salaf ended with the in the generation of Imam Malik, which are the early predecessors, and after that you have the generation of those who were taught by the Salaf, which have Imam Shafi, Imam Ahmed Al Harith Al Muhasibi, Ibn Qulab, who would be who's a very important figure in the story of Imam Al Ghazali. Then you have obviously also another important figure in the story of Imam Al Ghazali, which is Abu Qasim Al Junaid. I already did a documentary on him. So, but we would not really need to go into his views over here. And so, what we're going to do is that we're going to go into the context of the times of Imam Al Ghazali. So, the early period of Islam after the passing away of the Prophet ﷺ was a period of ijtihad. So, what happened was that since the companions, they never, not the companions, but during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, no one really needed to arrive at, let's say, a method, because any question that would arise would simply be answered by the Prophet ﷺ. Either it be a question of, let's say, fiqh, or so what would be a ruling in, let's say, this specific incident, or a theological question might arise, a question of spirituality might arise, and all of these questions were answered by the Prophet ﷺ because he was alive. And after his passing, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, since his guidance, or let's say divine guidance, in a clear sense, was no longer present, the companions, they arrived at different opinions, and they used different methodologies in their approaches. And so that led to the four jurisprudential schools, which were the Shafi, Maliki, Hanafi, and Hanbali schools of law. And Imam Al Ghazali is from the Shafi school of law, and he's actually one of its biggest scholars. And so now, as we move forward to a time in which is closer to the time of Imam Al Ghazali, one of the things that is very pertinent to the story of Imam Al Ghazali is the translation of the Greek texts. Now, there isn't really a specific date at where they started, but they started during the Abbasid era. And the translation of the Greek text, they largely related to things like medicine, things like astronomy, things like induction in science, and also philosophy, which is the most pertinent thing to the story of Imam Al Ghazali. So, as the translations of the Greek texts occurred in the Muslim world, it gave rise to thinkers. Two of the thinkers, well, not two, but one of the thinkers you can see at the right, bottom right of your screens, and let me point him out. This is Ibn Sina. So, Ibn Sina wasn't really an early philosophy. So, the term over here used is philosopher, but we will get into how that term really relates. So, Ibn Sina comes from a long line of philosophies or philosophers. The first of whom, one might say, well, not really the first, because many of the Greek texts were present even before, well, not before, but they were present during the time, and perhaps a bit earlier than the time of Al-Kindi. And then after Al-Kindi, you had Al-Farabi, and after Al-Farabi, the culmination, so to speak, of the peripatetic thought, as it is called, happened in Ibn Sina. So we will not really dive into the beliefs of Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi. I believe we can cover them when we go to Tahafut Al Falaasifa, for example. But Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi, they were one of the products of the philosophy that was translated from the Greek texts. Now, obviously, it wasn't only philosophy that was translated from the Greek text. It wasn't only Aristotle, for example, that was translated, or some parts of the works of Plato and Plotinus, but it was also history that was translated. It was also astronomy that was translated. It was also medicine that was translated. And so over here we find Al-Biruni. And the only reason that Al-Biruni is over here is that Al-Biruni was a mathematician, he was a scientist, he was a historian. So he was more so influenced, so to speak, by the texts of the Greeks that did not really relate to philosophy, because he was a mutakallim. So he was, in essence, the same as Imam Al-Ghazali, and he's around about the same time as Imam Al-Ghazali. So is Ibn Sina. They are both a generation before, and we covered this, like the period before, just before Imam Al-Ghazali, is covered in the Ibn Al-Haytham documentary that I did, which you guys can watch, inshallah ta'ala. So Al-Biruni is like the other side, so to speak, of the translation of the Greek texts. He isn't like, let's say, a dogmatist when it comes to the Greek text, but it's just to give you an overview that the Greek text did not only have influence in, let's say, theology or philosophy, they also had influence in history, they also had influence in medicine, they also had influence in astronomy and all of these different things. Ibn al-Haytham being one of the first, and not only one of the first, because Ibn Sina himself was uh, well, he wasn't the first, but he was one of the first who criticized Greek astronomy. So Greek astronomy was, by the time of Imam al-Ghazali, it was already thoroughly being challenged. It wasn't replaced yet, at least, but it was being challenged. So we covered this extensively in our documentary on Ibn al-Haytham over here, which we showed how he challenged uh, Ptolemy and Aristotle, and his theories on illumination, his theories on the movement of the celestial bodies, on geometry, and all of these different things, which went far beyond what the Greeks had ever done, and he challenged many of their beliefs. And so it was already a time in which the translations of the Greek texts and their views were not only dominant, but they were also being challenged. So the Muslims were, in a sense, passing beyond the Greeks in astronomy, medicine, and all of these different sciences. And they would pass beyond the Greeks in philosophy as well, and to which Imam Al Ghazali played a very pivotal role. But at the left side, we have Alparslan. So the second Seljuk king. So he wasn't the first; he was the second. But he is the, in essence, he could be the first because the main sort of, let's say, expansion and solidification was done by Alparslan. And so Alparslan came into power in 1063, I believe, if I'm not wrong. So it might be off by 1 or 2 years, but as far as I recall, he came into power at 1063. Now, Imam Ghazali was born at 1058, but the point over here is that much of Persia at the time was under the control of the Seljuks. Now, the Seljuks were also taking power away from the Fatimids, which was the Ismaili, so to speak, caliphate that was centered around Hijaz and some parts of North Africa and some parts of Syria as well. And so it was a different age that was occurring during the time of Imam al Ghazali. And the reason that the Seljuks are being brought in is primarily because they are very important to the story of Imam al Ghazali, as we will go on to see why. But during the time right before and by the time of the of birth of Imam al Ghazali, the Seljuks were highly influential, and they had solidified under Arp Arslan. So Arp Arslan came into power after the birth of Imam al-Ghazali, but for the intents and purposes of this presentation, we would go on and say that the Seljuks had already done it, because by the time that Imam Ghazali became a proper scholar, the Seljuks had solidified their rule. And so uh, just to recap on this slide, is the Greek texts were being translated and they were being challenged when it came to the sciences of astronomy, when it came to the sciences of medicine, when it came to the sciences of illumination, meaning how does the eye perceive, the theory of light. All of these were covered in my documentary on Ibn al-Haytham. And the only thing that wasn't really challenged at the time to any meaningful extent was the peripatetic thought, or the thought of the philosopher, the philosophers, of which Ibn Sina was the most brilliant. And also, by the time that Imam al-Ghazali was born, it was the time of the Seljuks, right? Alparslan just became a caliph 5 years after the birth of Imam al-Ghazali. But another thing that is very important over here, and if you noticed, it was that we only talked about two of the bullet points over here. So two of the bullet points that we talked about was the translation of the Greek text and Arpal and the rise of the Seljuks. We didn't talk about the birth of the Ashaira. Now, I have done a documentary on Abu Hassan al-Ashri, and in it you will find everything that you need to know about the beginnings of the Ashri school of thought. The Ashaira, in essence, just to give like a very small introduction, the Ashaira were a group of scholars, or a group of scholars known by the name of their founder, which was Abu Hassan al-Ashri, who also was, let's say, the precursor to him was Ibn Qulab, and the students of Imam Shafi, in the sense of Al Harith Al Muhasibi, the Kalamis of the early period, who spoke up against the Mu'tazila. So the Mu'tazila were also another rationalist group in early Islamic history, and the Ash'ara rose in opposition to them. So the basic reason that the Ash'ara rose, or the basic reason that the school was started by Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari, was to respond to the Mu'tazila using reason, so using their own method, to defend the Quran and the Sunnah using the method that was already employed by the Mu'tazila, and to defend the beliefs that were found in the Quran and the Sunnah. So it was a traditionalist, rationalist approach. The Ash'ari were pure rationalist in a sense, not pure rationalist in, let's say, the Western sense, but they were pure rationalist in the sense that they believed that every single one of the beliefs of Islam, perhaps not independently, but as a whole, can be proven. So God can be proven, and he can be rationally known. All of the basic main tenets of theology can be rationally known, and the prophethood of the Prophet ﷺ can be demonstrated rationally. So the reason that we are talking about the Ash'ari over here, or the Ash'ari school of theology, is because Imam Al Ghazali became perhaps one of the greatest Ash'ari scholars of all time. Now, the Ash'ari were not really that old by the time that Abu Hamid Al Ghazali was born, and they were about 150 years old. And by that time, the best scholar of the Ash'ari, so obviously Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari, he was the best before Imam al-Ghazali. But during the period of Imam al-Ghazali, when Imam al-Ghazali was a child, the best Ash'ari scholar was al-Juwayni, Muhammad al-Juwayni, who was obviously known as Imam al-Haramain. And we will talk about him as we move forward. But he was the biggest scholar, and he was teaching in Nishapur when Imam al-Ghazali was a child. And this line of scholarship came from al-Baqillani, al-Bayhaqi, and there's pretty good evidence, I would suggest, that al-Biruni himself was an Ash'ari. If not an Ash'ari, he was a mutakallim. That's not really up to dispute. He was a mutakallim. But whether he's an Ash'ari or not, that's a bit, let's say, contentious. But from my own estimation, the evidence is very clear. He was an Ash'ari. It is less clear with Ibn al-Haytham, but with al-Biruni, it's very clear that he was a mutakallim. That's 100%, and let's say 90% he was an Ash'ari. And so this is why the Ash'ari are important, because Imam al-Ghazali was an Ash'ari, and so we have to talk about the birth of the Ash'ari. So now moving on, we will go to, and now this is a map of the Seljuks. It's not really accurate to the birth of Imam al-Ghazali. This is a map, I believe, from 1080. But there wasn't much of a difference. Obviously, some battles were won, some territories was exchanged, but this is, in essence, the climate into which Imam al-Ghazali was born. So you would see over here that the arrow is not at Nishapur. The arrow is a bit above Nishapur. Now, I'm not sure if my, let's say, geography is absolutely accurate over here, but what the arrow is supposed to indicate is a little town known as Tus. T-U-S. Tus. And this is, by the way, where the name al-Tusi comes from, a person who's born in Tus. But Imam al-Ghazali was born in 1058 AD into a small town in Tus. And he was born in a highly religious, but a very poor family. Not poor to the capacity that they did not have anything to eat, but they were very poor. They were only, let's say, getting by. But the family was very religious, in which Imam al-Ghazali was born. He had a brother named Ahmad Al Ghazali, who would become a Sufi very early on in his life. But he's not really the topic of conversation, even though he, I think, deserves a talk on himself, because he was just as big of a Sufi as Imam Al Ghazali. Well, obviously not as big of a scholar, but just as big of a Sufi as Imam Al Ghazali would go on to become. And so Imam Al Ghazali was not your average, let's say, child. So these are two quotations. Both of them are from Munqidh min ad-Dilal, Deliverance from Error, which is written by Imam al-Ghazali. It's an autobiography, and in which Imam al-Ghazali says that from the period of adolescence, I have ventured into this vast ocean. I have fearlessly sounded its depths, and like a resolute diver, I have penetrated its darkness and dared its dangers and abysses. Now, he's talking about knowledge over here. And as can be seen very clearly, the way that Imam al Ghazali recalls his own youth is that he was unafraid to dive into the different viewpoints, to dive into the different controversies, let's say, and that were surrounded truth at the time. And he also said the thirst for knowledge was innate in me from an early age. It was like a second nature and implanted by God without any will on my part. No sooner had I emerged from boyhood than I had already broken the feathers of tradition and freed myself from hereditary beliefs. So Imam al-Ghazali, in a very early age, realized that most people believe simply because they are born in believing families. So the children of the Christians are Christians, the children of the Jews are Jews, the Christians or the children of let let's say the Sunnis are Sunnis, the children of let's say the Shia are Shia, the children of let's say the Mujassima whatsoever. You can think about it. So all of the viewpoints that the parents uphold, usually that is what the child goes on to uphold, and everyone is let's say blind following in that sense. And as he writes that, just as he escaped or got out of boyhood, he was able to break away from these chains. And so, Imam al Ghazali, there's actually very little that we know about Imam al Ghazali's early childhood. We know that he was a very inquisitive child, but we do not know anything beyond that apart from what he tells us himself. And but there are some early biographers that write that he learned from a local jurist, and he also learned from a local Sufi. So even though we don't really know if this is accurate, even though it's early, so the claim that he learned from, let's say, a Sufi sheikh in his early life is from some of the earliest biographers, and they also give the name of the sheikh that he learned from. And this is where both of the brothers, so Abu Hamid Al Ghazali and Ahmad Al Ghazali, were exposed to Sufism. But Abu Hamid Al Ghazali was not yet ready to become a Sufi. He wanted to venture beyond. And he realized that his small town of Tus could not contain his brilliance. And so he wanted to venture out of it. And another important thing about Imam al Ghazali in his adolescence, or let's say his early age, is that he realized the gap between the scholars and the awam or the layman. And much of his, let's say, scholarly pursuit was to make sure that that gap is bridged. And we will see that as we advance through his, let's say, life, obviously. And wait, why did the Tahafut? Okay. Okay. There was supposed to be another slide over here. Yep, here it is. Yeah, sorry, I just gave you a spoiler, spoiler of all that is to come. But we don't really know when Imam al Ghazali left Tus. There are some different dates that are given, but from the best of our estimations, we can say that he left around about 1075, and so the 1075 to 76. But just to be conservative, just to make sure that we are not, let's say, giving a date that is more so unknowable, we would say that he left between 1075 and 1078. Now, when Imam al Ghazali left for Nishapur, the reason that he went to Nishapur is that there was a scholar in Nishapur that was the greatest scholar of the time. Without a doubt, he was the greatest scholar of the time. He was the Shafi jurist, he was the Ashri theologian, Muhammad al Juwaini. So Imam al-Juwaini was an absolutely towering figure. I mean, it's almost an understatement to say that he was a towering figure. He was the master of Kalam. There wasn't Kalam, or let's say rational theology, that was written to the level of Imam Juwaini before him. The only person who was, let's say, more so advanced than Imam Juwaini in, let's say, formulating Ashri theology was Abu Hassan al-Ashri himself. So Imam al Jawaini was a massive deal in terms of his authority in jurisprudence and in substantive law. There was no doubt that he was the greatest scholar of the time. And Imam al-Juwayni was the teacher of many greats. So, for example, Imam al-Qushayri, who wrote Rasala al-Qushayriya, which is perhaps one of the most accepted texts of Sufism, was a student of Imam al-Juwayni. And Imam al-Juwayni was a teacher of many great scholars, and he himself was obviously the greatest of them all. He was called Imam al-Haramain, and because he became the Imam when he went to when he was forced out, rather than going, when he was forced out of Persia and Baghdad, and so he went to Hijaz and he became the scholar over there. He was so brilliant that he was immediately recognized for his brilliance in a land that was, let's say, foreign to him. And then he came back and he was teaching in Nishapur. And that is where Imam Al Ghazali went, and he became his pupil. Now, during the time that Imam Al Ghazali was the pupil of Imam Al Juwaini, Imam Ghazali did not really write any contributive text, so to speak. And the reason for that is that Imam al Ghazali at the time was learning Shafi fiqh. Most of his knowledge was from book reading. And he did write works. It's not like he did not write works, and he wrote pretty good works. But they were largely muqtasar of Shafi fiqh. So he wrote a muqtasar on the basic usul of Shafi fiqh. He wrote a summary of the Magnus Opus of Imam al-Juwaini in Shafi fiqh. But that was the extent of Imam Ghazali's writing at the time. So he was primarily learning at the time. But this does not mean that Imam Ghazali's brilliance was going, let's say, unnoticed. And there are a couple of quotations that we have from Imam al-Juwaini. One of the quotations is that he looks at a young Abu Hamid Al Ghazali, and he says that Al Ghazali is an ocean of knowledge that one can drown in. And another quotation, and this is perhaps the more telling one, is that he looked at Imam Al Ghazali and he said that you have buried me while I live. The meaning of the saying was that you have surpassed me in knowledge while I live. And he also said another line right after this one, which is that could you not have waited for me to die? So usually what occurs is that the teacher dies and then the pupil surpasses him. But Imam al-Ghazali had done so while al-Juwaini was alive. And coming from a scholar to the level of Imam al-Juwaini, it is praise that I don't believe that Imam Juwaini gave that praise to anybody else. He had a lot of brilliant scholars nearby him, and he had a lot of brilliant students, but he never gave that sort of high praise to anybody else. So it's very clear that Al-Juwaini realized the brilliance in Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali. So Imam Al-Ghazali stayed with Imam Al-Juwaini as long as he did not pass away. So Imam Juwaini passed away in 1085 AD. And so now you can see that we have this period of 7 years. It could be 6 years because we don't really know the date when Imam Al Ghazali was appointed as. Well, we'll get to it. But these 7 years that are between the death of Imam Al Juwaini and Baghdad Nizamiya, what they connote to is Imam Al Ghazali gaining favor. So the Caliph at the time, if I'm not wrong, was Sultan Malik Shah, and he had perhaps the most famous bureaucrat in Islamic history, which was Nizam al Mulk. So that was actually a title. I believe his name was Abu Ali al Hassan. I believe his name was. But Nizam al Mulk took a special liking to Imam al Ghazali, and he gave a lot of honors to Imam al Ghazali, and he advanced the career of Imam al Ghazali in this 6 year period. So Imam al Ghazali was teaching in this period. He was not yet the greatest teacher of the time, but he was slowly becoming it. And by 1092 AD, he was appointed the chair of Shafi law in Baghdad's Nizamiya. So the Nizamiya, just to give like a bit of an overview, the Nizamiya were in essence universities. So they were the universities of the highest standard of the time. They were state sponsored by the Seljuks, and they had the best of scholars. And they didn't only teach fiqh, they taught all of the sciences. So they were the highest standard of learning in that time. So there wasn't a greater standard of learning than the Nizamiya during the world at that time, right? So they are the most prestigious universities or madrasas, Nizamiya, whichever like term you prefer. So Imam Ghazali was appointed the chief Shafi'i jurist, Shafi'i law expert, and teacher in the Baghdad Nizamiya, which was the greatest university in that time in the world. And so that was a huge honor, obviously, for Imam Al Ghazali, and it was a huge honor in general for any scholar to be appointed to the greatest teaching position and scholarly position in the world at the time. And so this is when Imam Al Ghazali starts writing works that are contributions and that change more so, and we will get to it, but that change, in essence, the entire history of Islamic thought. So I will. I think it's been 30 minutes, so I don't want to bore you guys. So I'm gonna let's say speed it up a bit because we're only halfway through. So one of the first works that Imam Al Ghazali wrote as a contribution was called Maqasid Al Falaasifa, not Tahafut, Maqasid Al Falaasifa, the purposes of the philosophers. Now, what Imam Al Ghazali had done over here, and which was quite clever of him, what Imam Al Ghazali did was that he wrote a book that defined the basic viewpoints of the philosophers. As you realize, we talked about previously, Al Farabi, Al Kindi, Ibn Sina, the tradition of the philosophers that had taken from the Greeks. Now, they obviously had a metaphysics and an ontology and an entire belief system. And so Imam Al-Ghazali, the book he wrote was Maqasid Al Falaasifa, which defined all of those principles, the basic purposes, the basic views of this group of philosophers, so to speak. And it was very well received. So all of the philosophers at the time, so all of the falasifa, so to speak, and I don't want to really use the word philosopher because falsafa or the philosopher refers to certain individuals who had certain metaphysical beliefs. It doesn't refer to like a philosopher in general, because if you were to say a philosopher in general, then every single scholar in Islamic history would be a philosopher. For example, Imam Shafi, the father of Islamic jurisprudence, would be a legal philosopher, and he would be called a philosopher in modern terminology. And similarly, even the Hadith scholars would be called philosophers, or and the astronomers, or let's say the theologians, everyone would be a philosopher if we are using the modern terminology. But the word falasifa, and then obviously the falsafi, meaning the philosopher, referred to a certain group of individuals that held to certain Greek influenced beliefs, either it be Neoplatonic beliefs, either it be Aristotelian beliefs, uh, either it even be any other beliefs that you could get from, let's say, other previous ancient philosophers or ancient traditions. They were called the philosopher. And so that is the group whose, let's say, basic viewpoints Imam Al Ghazali was laying down in the book called Maqasid Al Falaasifa. Now, the book was received very well by the philosophers. Some of them even imagined that Imam Al Ghazali had become a Falsafi himself. And even when later the texts went to Europe, uh, many people actually thought that Tahafut Al Falaasifa was written by someone else, and Maqasid Al Falaasifa was written by someone else, because Imam Al Ghazali had done a very, let's say, a great introduction to the belief of the Islamic Neoplatonists, so to speak. And so the European scholars were a myth. This, it says that Ghazali wrote Maqasid, also says that Ghazali wrote Tahafut, but this dude who wrote who wrote Maqasid is clearly a philosopher. He's clearly a Falsafi. So how could he have written Tahafut? And so many of them believe that Tahafut was written by someone else, and Maqasid was written by someone else, which led some of them to believe that Al Ghazali was a Falsafi himself. So after Imam Al Ghazali had written Maqasid, the work he wrote, and perhaps one of the works that he is most well known for, and this work would lay the foundation of, let's say, classical kalam, or let's say post classical kalam, which is Tahafut Al Falaasifa. Now, Tahafut Al Falaasifa is a purely rational critique, meaning that there isn't a single religious argument, purely religious argument, in the entire book. It's a purely rational, scathing critique of 20 beliefs of this group that we talked about, the Falasifa. It is primarily directed at Al Farabi and Ibn Sina. So it's a very scathing critique. So Imam Al Ghazali is extremely harsh in it, but he's also extremely rational in it. It's a purely rational, logic based critique, a purely philosophical critique in that sense. And so what Tahafut al Falaasifa, in essence, had done was that it was perhaps the greatest Uno reverse, let's say, intellectual Uno reverse in the history of intellectual Islamic history, at least, which is that he had written Maqasid. And the reason that Imam Ghazali had written Maqasid was because he knew that the philosophers, whenever they were challenged, what they would do is that they would claim that they are misinterpreted. They would claim that, this person who is criticizing us, he does not really understand our views. And so he's way too meager minded, so to speak, to understand our views. And so and therefore they would just hand wave critique away. And so by writing Maqasid, Imam al Ghazali had actually philosophers were forced to admit that al Ghazali understood them. And once they were forced to admit that, they had includes beliefs on, let us say, wait, did I go offline? Wait, did I? Um, so am I back now? I think the stream, like, for a second lagged or something. Because I got the notification that. Okay, so I'm back. Alhamdulillah. Wait. Guys, can someone tell me in the comment section that can you guys hear me? Okay, you can hear me. That's great. So is it lagging now or is it fine? Is it fine now or is it still lagging? Oh, thank you. Okay, so sorry about that. We're going to return to the stream. Now, what Imam Ali had done was that he had laid an intellectual trap. And I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but someone said that it lagged for 2-3 minutes. So I'm making sure that this point is covered, which is that what Imam Al Ghazali had done was that he had laid an intellectual trap. So since he had written Maqasid al Falaasifa, and the philosophers had accepted that he understood their beliefs, they could not argue now when he wrote Tahafut al Falaasifa that this was a man who was ignorant on their beliefs. So, what is the book actually? So, Tahafut al Falaasifa is, as I previously said, a purely rational, scathing criticism of 20 of the beliefs of the philosophers, including their beliefs on, let's say, miracles, their beliefs on divine attributes, their beliefs on the knowledge of God, their beliefs on the resurrection of bodies, their beliefs on the eternality of the world. Now, from 20 of these beliefs, Imam Al Ghazali determines that 3 of the beliefs are completely and utterly irreligious and they cannot be excused. But apart from that, the 17 beliefs, he says that even though they are unorthodox, but they are not guilty of being irreligious. Now, the three beliefs on which he does say that these beliefs are completely and utterly irreligious are: number one, the eternality of the world; number two, God's ignorance, astaghfirullah, of the knowledge of particulars. So the philosopher held that God knew particulars, but he knew them in a universal way. So he knew them through universals. And so he was directly, he didn't know particulars directly. And I'm covering this more in detail in my upcoming documentary on Abu Hamid Al Ghazali. So I won't really go into a lot of detail. So that was the second belief. The third belief was their denial of the resurrection of bodies. So it was, as I said, a purely rational critique. We will not really go into the philosophical arguments Al Ghazali gives, and let's say their strength or weakness, or all of these different things, because I don't really want to make it complicated. Many of you asked me to keep it simple, so I'm going to keep it simple. But just to mention over here that Tahafut Al Falaasifa actually was one of the biggest contributions to Islamic kalam and to Islamic, let's say, quote unquote, philosophy, because it advanced sciences forward. What Al Ghazali had done was he had done something that was, well, I wouldn't say unprecedented, but he had done something that wasn't really done before, which is that he had dedicated a lot of his time studying the beliefs of the philosophers, not only the Islamic Neoplatonists, but also the materialists, all of the different varying viewpoints that you find in the Greeks. And he had spent a lot of his time doing that, and then he had rationally evaluated them, and he had wrote a rational criticism of them. Now, what this led to was a new kalam emerging, so to speak, in which falsafa was integrated. And this was done by thinkers such as Saifuddin al-Amidi, Fakhruddin al-Razi, thinkers such as al-Taftazani, al-Sharif al-Jurjani, and al-Iji, and Jalal ad-Din al-Diwani, and all of these different mutakallimin of the later centuries, and which are called verifiers. And so what it had done was that it had advanced the sciences forward. It had also unclutched, so to speak, the Islamic tradition from the clutches of Greek philosophy. As we talked about previously, that during the time, Ibn al-Haytham had already posed a lot of challenges to the viewpoints of the Greeks, either it be in astronomy, medicine, or in their theories of physics, or in their theories of geometry, and their theories of how eyesight occurs, what is light, and all of these different things. Now, Tahafut al-Falaasifa was the refutation, or let's say the pushing back of the Islamic tradition on Greek philosophy and the Islamic Greek philosophers, so to speak, the Peripatetics, the Neoplatonists. And so this led to a thorough, let's say, refutation or critique of Ibn Sina, Al-Farabi, and the philosophers by the scholar Fakhruddin al-Razi, who would come about 50 years after the passing away of Imam al-Ghazali. And so Imam al-Ghazali over here, he doesn't really go into a lot of details. What he does is that he shows that owing to the principles of the philosophers themselves, these 20 beliefs are untenable. And in my own opinion, he does show that quite well, not on all of the beliefs. So I do believe some of the arguments he gives are weak, but majority of the arguments are very good. So for example, his arguments against the eternality of the world are perhaps one of the best ever written, which is the first exposition, so to speak. So now we're not going to lament on this too much, and we're going to move forward. The Tahafut Al Falaasifa deserves like an entire video on its own. So we're going to move forward. And so now what occurs is that Imam al-Ghazali didn't only write Tahafut al-Falaasifa, he also wrote 3 other works of logic, mantiq, and he also wrote a work of theology which is known as Al-Iqtisad, which is moderation of belief. Now, Al-Iqtisad is a very basic text in the sense that it's not really an advanced text. The work of his teacher, which is Muhammad al-Juwaini, which is called Al-Irshad, was a more advanced text in Ash'ari rationalist theology than the work of Imam al-Ghazali himself. But Al-Iqtisad, as we talked about at the beginning of this stream, is that Imam al-Ghazali saw that there was a huge gap right, between the awam and the alim. And so he wanted to bridge that gap. Al-Iqtisad is an attempt to do that. So what Imam al-Ghazali does in Al-Iqtisad, or moderation of belief, is that he uses terminology that is very layman friendly. So he doesn't use very technical kalam terminology, which is very refined. He uses terminology that is more so simple, that is more so in the, let's say, daily vocabulary of the normal Muslim. And if you remember, going back to the stream again, and the reason that I'm going back is because now we can show it, right? Which is that what Imam Al Ghazali also did while he was a student of Al Juwayni was he wrote Mukhtasar. What is a Mukhtasar? It's basically a summary and abridgment, so to speak, of some of the texts of the Shafi'ah. He wrote a basic introduction into Shafi fiqh. He wrote a Mukhtasar of his teacher, Al Juwayni, his magnus opus text in Shafi fiqh, which was a very complex text, by the way. And the reason that he wrote these summaries was because he wanted to bridge the gap between the awam and the scholars. So now moving forward from that, after he wrote three more logic texts, as I said previously, he wrote some other texts, but Tahafut Al Falaasifa and Al Iqtisad were the primary texts of the time. He wrote another text, Miyar Al Kalam, in which he goes into some, let's say, more so different ideas. And Imam Al Ghazali also in logic, another thing that people don't know is that Imam Al Ghazali was quintessential in making logic mandatory in the madrasa system. So before Imam Al Ghazali, even though logic was taught, but it was not mandatory. So what Imam Al-Ghazali did was that he believed that a person who does not reason, or a person who does not know basic logic, is a person whose views just simply cannot be accepted. And so that's why logic, after Imam Al-Ghazali's passing and even during his life, it became quintessential in the madrasa system. And this would later lead to, Ibn Sina had already done it. So Ibn Sina uh, had done some advancements in mantiq. Imam Al-Ghazali also did some advancements. He also, not to the extent of Ibn Sina, but he also did some advancements. And then after Imam Al-Ghazali, the real advancements of logic began to occur, because logic now became a quintessential part of the syllabus of the madrasas. And so then you find scholars such as Al-Abhari, you scholars such as Fakhruddin al-Razi, you find scholars such as the great Ottoman scholar Ismail Jalambavi, who do great advancements in the field of logic. But we are digressing over there. Now, Imam al-Ghazali had two crises in his life. The first crisis was an intellectual crisis. And I will not really go into that because I already believe that the stream has gone a bit longer than I had expected it to. But anyways, so the first crisis was an intellectual crisis. Imam al-Ghazali started questioning logic itself. So he initially questioned experience. So the example that he gave was that when we look in the sky, we see stars as small little glowing pearls. But in reality, they are far bigger than the Earth. And so over here, he claimed that, mathematics and logic had shown that our perception can deceive us. And so then a very unsettling question arose for Al-Ghazali, which is that just like logic had become a judge over experience, showing its falsity, is it not possible that there is a third judge that could show us the falsity of logic? And if this judge has not been discovered, it does not mean that this judge therefore does not exist. And so he was grappling with this problem and he couldn't really solve it. And then he was also hurled into, let's say, an existential crisis by the idea of dreams. So dreams are quite the human experience. When you're dreaming, you feel it. When you're dreaming, if you're hurt, you feel pain, you feel love, you feel envy, you feel all of the different emotions that are supposed to be only present when you're awake. So you see, you feel, you hear, all of the five senses are there in dreams, but apparently none of the stimuli are, right? So obviously the stimuli for touch is you touch something, smell is you smell something, seeing is that you see something. And so what Imam al-Ghazali couldn't, let's say, come in terms with is that obviously, sure, we wake up and we say this dream was just like the play of the mind, so to speak. But what if this life that we call the waking world is also a dream? And that when we will awake from it, we would say that, how delusional we were, that we were believing that this is life, whereas it was simply just a dream. Now, this is where many of the similarities to Descartes are pointed out by some people. And the reason for that is that Descartes also obviously had the same sort of ideas, like Imam Al Ghazali over here. He questioned experience, he questioned logic. But the difference is that Imam Al Ghazali did not claim they are doubtful. It was only a period of his life that occurred for a month or two, after which Imam al-Ghazali writes in Munqidh min al-Dilal that through rigorous prayer and through, let's say, God's favor upon him, God uplifted him from this state. And he stopped being a thoroughgoing skeptic. And all of the, let's say, certainties of logic and experience came back into his heart stronger than before. So Imam al-Ghazali never, so apart from this one period, he never believed that they are doubtful. So he wasn't like Descartes. So he believed them. But the reason that he believed them was due to God's granting favor over him rather than, let's say, any syllogism or any argument. So the second crisis that occurs in Imam al-Ghazali, and this occurs throughout 1094, which is a spiritual crisis. So Imam al-Ghazali writes that throughout his scholastic works, which means the works of Kalam, throughout all of his different, let's say, pursuits, intellectual pursuits, he had come to be firm on God, judgment, and on what he calls mystical experience. So these were the three things that he was utterly sure about. But after he saw what was of his state, so let the man speak himself. So he says, examining my actions, the most fair scheme is seeming of which were my lecturing and professorial occupations, I found that I was engrossed in studies of little value, profitless regarding my salvation. I probed the motives of my teaching and found that it was only actuated by vain desire for honor and reputation. I perceived that I was on the edge of an abyss and that without any immediate conversion, I should be doomed to eternal fire. So, what had occurred was that Imam al Ghazali, since he was, as he said, that due to his researches, due to his different studies, he had realized that the afterlife, God, and mystical experiences were absolutely true. So now he had to confront the idea of him being judged. And when he confronted that idea, he had to realize that he had to show some actions of his life that could save him on the day of resurrection. And so when he examined his actions, the more far seeming, meaning the more, let's say, pure in intent and the more pure, most pure action in general that he found were his teaching profession, right? So he wrote all of these works for, let's say, the awam to bridge the gap, as we spoke about previously. He wrote all of these works against heretical groups. He wrote all of these works against Falaasifa who were bringing the wretched Greek philosophy into Muslim, let's say, viewpoints and beliefs. They were distorting the religion. And he wrote all of these works against them. And so he thought that this, him teaching people and these writing against, let's say, the heretical groups and all of these different things would save him on the day of judgment. But when he prodded his heart, he realized that they weren't really done for God. They were done because he wanted people to believe that he was a great scholar. He wanted people to believe that he was extremely intelligent. He wanted people to believe that he was Hujjat al-Islam, the proof of Islam. And so they weren't really true. They weren't true in the sense that they weren't done for God, right? They were done for dunyavi means, done for the worldly life, done for himself. And so what this did was that it wasn't like just a spiritual crisis of this realization. Imam al-Ghazali actually became extremely sick. So he writes in Munqidh min al-Dilal, and this quote is also from Munqidh min al-Dilal, by the way. So his own autobiography, which he wrote. So he writes in Munqidh min al-Dilal that he was so in crisis that he couldn't eat anything. So whenever he ate something, he would vomit it out. He couldn't drink anything. And it was so bad that physicians were called to his home. And when they examined him, they said that this is not a matter of any physical ailment because the man is completely fine. It's a matter of the heart. And if he wants to survive, he must resolve that. So he must resolve whatever, let's say, issue he's going through mentally. If he does not resolve that, then he will die. Because Imam al Ghazali was so frail that he was just bones. And so it was a crisis that was having far reaching physical effects on him. And so he had read the works of the Sufis by this time. He had read all of the works by the great Sufis, such as the early Sufis, such as Hassan al Basri, such as Bashir al Hafi, such as Sari al Sakati, Maruf al Kharki, such as Bayazid Bastami, such as uh, Abu Qasim al Junaid, and all of the early mutakallimin and sorry, early Sufia. And also some of them were his contemporaries, such as Al-Qushayri, Al-Sulami. And so all of these Sufis, the works he had read. But in order to know something, Imam al-Ghazali writes about this. This is about like mystical experience. So the point about mystical experience is that anyone who has not really had a mystical experience denies its occurrence. So Imam al-Ghazali compares denying the occurrence of mystical experience to denying the occurrence of drunkenness. So he writes this in Ihya Ulum, for example, which is that you may pour, let's say, 100 cups, but unless you drink, you will not be intoxicated. And the only reason that you would know that such a state as intoxication exists is due to people telling you, right? It's just the same thing with sexual intimacy, for example. A person who has never had it would never know what it feels like. But he would know it's very pleasurable. And the reason that he would know that is because everyone has told him so. It has come to him through reliable testimonials by other individuals that are of a good moral fortitude. And so, just like that, so many of the Sufis have reported this. And so, it must be true. It comes to us by testimonials of authorities that are beyond reproach when it comes to their morality. And so that is how he knew that this must be true. But now his heart called for him to dive into it. It wasn't enough just simply reading the works of the Sufi. It wasn't enough just simply reading of all of the different intricacies of mystical experiences. He must experience it himself in order to know what they actually are. Now, it's, for example, Imam al-Ghazali writes about this in Munkar min al-Dalal, that it's almost impossible to explain to a person who has not had mystical experience what exactly mystical experience is. So it's like explaining what colors are to a blind man. So imagine you're trying to explain what colors are to a blind man. How would you even go about doing it? How would you say to a blind person who has never seen colors, by the way, what colors are? Would you say that they are different light fragments that fall upon different materials, and some of materials reflect more, some reflect less, and so therefore light is produced in some capacity? How would that person get a picture of the colors? He would have no clue unless he had sight to see the colors himself. And just like that is mystical experience. Unless a person has experienced it, you can't really describe it to anybody. And if you describe it to them, you would give them a false interpretation. So just like with the blind man, for example, if you were to tell the blind man about the color red, the blind man would come to every single conclusion apart from the color red, right? So he would probably have the most weird view of something that has nothing to do with the color red, but we try to explain the color red. So that's what mystic, and this is why many people don't understand some of the works of the Sufis, because you're not supposed to understand them. You have supposed to feel them. But anyways, moving forward, we don't want to really get caught up in this. So what Imam al-Ghazali writes about this further on, and it is regarding his pull. So what had occurred was that every single day he would make the firm intention to leave everything behind and to give his life to God, and to give his life in worship, to give his life in dhikr, to give his life for the path of God and in the love of God. But every single day he would break this oath because the pulls of the world, the desires of the world were way too alluring. He even writes the eternal battle in Munkar min al-Dalal that he would make a solid resolution the night, and in the morning his devil, or let's say his nafs, would whisper to him and say, well, you have worked so hard. You're at the highest, you're at the pinnacle of Islamic scholarship. If you leave it now, no one's going to give it to you again, right? This is just a phase that will pass. So why are you throwing everything away for a phase, so to speak? And so on this, Imam al-Ghazali writes, and it's one of the most beautiful passages in Munkar min al-Dalal. He writes, on the one side, the world kept me bound to my post in the chains of covetousness. On the other side, the voice of religion cried to me, up, up, Thy life is nearing its end, and thou hast a long journey to make. All thy pretended knowledge is naught but falsehood and fantasy. If thou dost not think now of thy salvation, when wilt thou think of it? If thou dost not break thy chains today, when wilt thou break them? So, after this comes Imam Al Ghazali's seclusion. So, what Abu Hamid Al Ghazali had done, and this is just astounding. I mean, even now, it doesn't really make sense to me after reading Imam Al Ghazali for 5 years about how he was able to do it. So, Imam Al Ghazali was at the pinnacle of Islamic scholarship. As we talked about previously, he was given the greatest post in Islamic scholarship at the time, which was he was the head of Shafi fiqh in the Nizamiya of Baghdad. And he was a close friend of Nizam al Mulk. He was also a friend of the Sultan of the time, which was Sultan Malik Shah. And so he was the greatest scholar of the time in terms of his works. He was the greatest scholar of the time in terms of his posts. He was the greatest scholar of the time in terms of his wealth, in terms of the honors that he had been given. So Imam al-Ghazali had everything that you could imagine a scholar would want or a scholar would have. But what he did was something that was just extraordinary. He gave everything away. So in terms of his wealth, what he done with his wealth was that he just left enough amount for his family so that his family could survive, and he took enough on his journey so that he could survive. He gave everything else in charity. And what bahana, or let's say what excuse he had given to the caliph was that he said to the caliph that I want to go and perform the Hajj and I will be back. But he was not going simply for the Hajj, so he was going for the Hajj, or he wanted to do it down the line. But he was just going to do saluk, as the Sufis call it, which is wayfaring, isolation, seclusion, giving your life for the path of God. And he left it. He left his family behind. He was actually criticized for this by some of the Sufis for leaving his family behind. But he left his family behind. He left all of his wealth. He left his post and he went. Now, we don't really know how much time he spent in different areas. We do know that he spent 2 years in Syria. We know that he was, and this is like perhaps one of the most beautiful stories that you will find, is that he actually became a sweeper in the mosque of Damascus. And while he was a sweeper in the mosque of Damascus, like no one knew that this was Al Ghazali, because obviously when they had seen him, let's say if anyone in the mosque had seen him, they had seen him in the scholarly garb. They hadn't seen him in the garb of, let's say, a sweeper, and in the garb of a man who's patching up his own clothes, who wears the minimum of all things, and who's living in the mosque itself, doesn't even have a home. And so he was sweeping, and so a young man walked into the Mosque of Damascus. And by the way, in this very mosque, his books were being taught, the books of Abu Hamid Al Ghazali. And so a young man walks into this mosque and he's asking a very complex question to the philosophers, sorry, not the philosophers, to the scholars that are sitting in the Mosque of Damascus, and none of them can answer it. Not a single one knows what to tell the young man. And while the young man is leaving, very disappointed that no scholar in the Grand Mosque of Damascus could answer his question, Imam al Ghazali goes up to him as a sweeper. He repeats the question that the young man had asked, and he gives the answer. And the young man is absolutely stunned. And so the young man goes back to the scholars and he says, what kind of scholars are you? I asked, the best scholars of Syria to give me an answer, but they couldn't. But this sweeper gave me the answer. And so then he repeats the answer that Al Ghazali had given. And so the ulama were shocked. They were like, how the hell does the sweeper come up with such an eloquent answer? But when they put their brains to it, they realized that it was Al Ghazali. And so when he was caught out, meaning people realized who he was, he left the Mosque of Damascus. Then he went to Al Aqsa. So he went to Al Aqsa Mosque and he did a lot of adkar there. He did a lot of worship there. He did a lot of remembrance of God over there. And it was also during this time that he started writing his magnus opus, which was Ihya Ulum. He started writing it during his travels. And so then he went and he performed the Hajj. And so after he had performed the Hajj, after he had performed the pilgrimage, he returned back to his family. And when he returned back to his family, he remained in seclusion. So the total period of his complete and utter seclusion and his wayfaring in the path of God was 10 years. So Ghazali writes himself, 10 years passed in this manner. During my successive periods of meditation, there were revealed to me things impossible to recount. All that I shall say for the edification of the reader is this. I learned from the short source that the Sufis are the true pioneers on the path of God, that there is nothing more beautiful than their life, nor more praiseworthy than their role of conduct, nor purer than their morality. The intelligence of thinkers, the wisdom of philosophers, the knowledge of the most learned doctors of the law would in vain combine their efforts in order to modify or improve their doctrine and morals. It would be impossible. So, what Imam Al Ghazali was says revealed to me, what he means is that things were shown to him by God. When he had removed the barrier of this world and the next world, because this world is simply a shadow of the spiritual realm in Al Ghazali's thought, which is that when that veil was removed between this world and the other world, the truth of all things, not all things, but the truth of some things, were revealed to Abu Hamid Al Ghazali. And we will talk about Kashf, we will talk about mystical experiences when we cover them in Imam Al Ghazali's books. But there's something that all of you should know is that no one denies this. So all of the four schools are agreed that not only is it possible, but the elect of God have these experiences. So one of the, let's say, evidences of this is that when Umar radiallahu anh had sent the army to Persia, they were in the middle of the battle. I forget who the commander was, but the commander was leading the force, and there was an ambush against the Muslim armies. And this is a Sahih report, by the way. And so there was an ambush against the Muslim armies, and the commander heard the voice of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh, telling him, on the left, on the left. The ambush was coming from the left, so he was able to, put his forces and defend it. But the thing is that Umar radiallahu anh was in Medina. The army was in Persia. And when they returned, the army, the commander said that, and Umar was on the minbar, by the way, when he said left, left, he was giving a khutbah. And so when the army returned, they relayed the incident. And so Umar radiallahu anh, in Medina, in the minbar, could not only perceive what was happening in Persia, because how else would he say on the left, but he could also say something in Medina that was heard by a companion in Persia. Is that not a karama? But nobody denies this. So Ibn Taymiyyah actually, who is one of, let's say, the more harsher persons on Tasawwuf, he recounts that karama of the awliya is something that completely occurs, and anyone who denies it is an idiot, and anyone who denies it has deviated. So no one denies this. But we will go into the mechanisms of it, we will go into the metaphysics of it when we advance through the works of Abu Hamid Al Ghazali. So now comes his magnus opus. So Imam Nawawi says about this book that if all of the books of Islam were lost apart from the Quran, Ihya Ulum would be enough to suffice this entire nation. So Ihya Ulum is the revival of the religious sciences. It is divided into 40 sections. And we will not cover it, because we will cover it when we advance through the Ghazali reading club. We will go through the entirety of the Ihya Ulum. But the Ihya Ulum is just the greatest book of practical religion that has ever been written by anybody. And so Imam Al-Ghazali goes through every single part of the Muslims' interaction with God in Ihya Ulum. So what is thankfulness? What is patience? What is forgiveness? What is mercy? What is hope? What is fear? What does it mean to rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What does it mean to be patient in calamity? What does it mean to remember death, right? How should a person pray? How should a person fast? How should a person do wudu? What does it mean to purify oneself? What does outer and inner purification mean? All of these different things. What does loving God mean? What is sincerity? And all of the every single part that relates to practical religion, Imam Al Ghazali has covered in Ihya Ulum. It is the revival of the religious sciences. And about it, Imam Al-Razi wrote, Imam Al-Razi writes about this, that it is as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had gathered all of the sciences under one dome and he showed them to Abu Hamid Al Ghazali. About it, Imam Al-Nawawi also wrote, he said that many things that were beyond our imagination, Imam Al-Ghazali had simplified in Ihya Ulum. It is perhaps one of the most accepted books of tasawwuf in Islamic history. Some people have so a very minute group of individuals have some criticism against it, largely owing to the traditions that are used in it. Some say that weak traditions or fabricated traditions are used. Fabricated traditions are not used, weak traditions are used, and they can be used in the works of the tasawwuf. There's nothing against them because they're not works of fiqh or kalam. But we will not really go into it because it's a very minor criticism of the book. But Ihya Ulumuddin is his greatest work. There's no doubt. He didn't write a greater work than Ihya Ulumuddin. As I said, it's divided into 40 sections, and the first chapter is of knowledge, and the last chapter is chapter is of the remembrance of death and the afterlife. And so it goes from start to finish. So, what is religion to you? Your end, your grave, and what will occur to you after you have passed away. And so absolutely magnificent work. So you don't go into Ahia the same person. So you go into Ahia one person, you leave Ahia another person. It's not possible for a person to read Ihya Ulumuddin and come out of it the same. It's just not possible. So Ihya is not really an philosophical work. He does use kalam in it. So he does use kalam in many different areas. He gives arguments in it. It's purely a work of spirituality. It's a work to tell you how to uh, move towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So move towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from a station of distance to a station of qurba, of nearness. Now, since the stream has gone on very long, we will now be moving. Oh, it's been 1 hour and 20 minutes. So now we will be moving to like ending it. And I didn't cover Ihya a lot for the purpose that we will be going through it in our reading club. And so after like Arbain fi Usuluddin and Al Maqsad Al Asna, we will go to Riyadat Al Nafs, which is disciplining the soul, uh, which is a book from Ihya Ulumuddin. And so therefore, I will not really dive into Ihya Ulumuddin a lot. But if you guys are more so interested and can't wait, I have covered about half of the entirety of the Ihya on my Twitter, and so you can go over there and check it out. But now, returning to what Imam Al Ghazali did after it, he was, in essence, compelled, you might even say forced, by the Caliph, by the ruling elite at the time, to return to teaching in Baghdad. So here, I believe, returned to teaching in Nishapur. Yeah, he didn't go to Baghdad again. So he returned to teaching in 1106 in Nishapur, and it was during this time that he wrote his famous Al Mutasfa. So again, we don't have time, otherwise I would tell you what Al Mutasfa is, but it's basically the best work of jurisprudence after Imam Shafi's Risala. So every single work of jurisprudence of Asul al-Fiqh written after al-Mutasfa is in essence its abridgment. It's that massive of a work. It's that brilliant of a work. It was also during this time that Imam al-Ghazali wrote many of his more famous works, such as Badayatul Hidayah, Ihya al-Walad, Al-Maqsad al-Asna, Kamiya Sa'adat, Arbayan fi Usuluddin, Mishkat al-Anwar, and other works of Imam al-Ghazali that are very famous. He wrote during this period in his life. And then comes his final seclusion in Tus. So in 1110 AD, Imam al-Ghazali went to his final seclusion in Tus. And he would remain in Tus until his passing away in 1111 AD. So he passed away on a December. So I believe, I forget the month, but he passed away on the December of 1111 AD. And his death is also a very beautiful story, that Imam Al Ghazali woke up for Tahajjud, and he did Tahajjud, he did Fajr, he did his adhkar that he would do after Fajr, so he would remain in remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala well after Fajr. And so after he had done all of that, he asked his brother Ahmad Al Ghazali, as we talked about previously. Ahmad Al Ghazali was his famous Sufi brother. And so he asked Ahmad Al Ghazali what day it was. And so he told him it's a Monday. And so Imam Al Ghazali asked for his burial shroud to be brought to him. And as his burial shroud was brought to him, he stretched it out, he kissed it, then he laid on his bed and he passed away. And while he was passing away, he said to, obviously, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he said, "My Lord, I come willingly." And after he had passed away, underneath his pillow was found a written poem. Now, there is a translation of the poem on Seeker's Guide, and it's a very long poem, so therefore I will not repeat it, but it's absolutely beautiful. So what you should do after this stream ends, read or search up on Google Ghazali's deathbed poem, and you will find that's the poem that he wrote the night previously, because the awliya of God, they know when it's their time. And so he obviously knew that it was his time to go, and so he had wrote a poem before, like the night previously. And so he passed away in 1011 AD. And so one thing that you might notice is that Imam al-Ghazali went in seclusion. He left everything while he was still a young man. He was 38 years of age when he went on his seclusion. So he had, let's say, his entire life ahead of him, and it was during that time that he thought that he would go into hellfire because he had no works. And so I'm 26 years of age, and I'm sure many of you are younger than me, but maybe some of you are older than me. And so it's never too young to worship God. It's never too young to turn towards him. Now, we will talk with our final slide on Abu Hamid Al Ghazali's legacy. Now, there is perhaps no one else who is as accepted as Abu Hamid Al Ghazali in our tradition after the four Imams. He is the master when it comes to Tasawwuf, Sufism. He is the master when it comes to Ilm Al Kalam. He is the master when it comes to Asul Al Fiqh. He is the master when it comes to substantive law. He is the master when it comes to practical religion. And there is no field that Imam al-Ghazali has not changed. So Ilm al-Kalam can be divided into two periods, before Ghazali and after Ghazali. Similarly, legal philosophy in Islam can be divided into two periods, before Al-Mutasfa by Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali and after Al-Mutasfa by Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali. Works of practical religions can be divided into two categories. Works of practical religion before Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, works of practical religion after Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali. You get the gist of it. He led to what we know as post-classical kalam. He led to what we know as the Ghazalian Sufi way. So Imam Al-Ghazali was an extremely tough and strict Sufi, in the sense that he was very strict. So he would advocate for people to be poor rather than rich. He would advocate people not to get married unless they have control over their sexual desires. He would advocate very rigorous daily worship routines. So if you read his Bidayatul Hidayah, the religious routine that he gives is extremely rigorous. He was extremely strict on people who preached falsehood. He was extremely strict on people who did open displays of sinful acts. So this entire idea that the Sufi is some sort of individual who loves everybody, who takes everybody as they are, that's not true. Imam al-Ghazali was extremely strict. He held a couple of legal opinions due to his strictness that are actually rejected. So they were rejected later on by Imam al-Nawawi, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, and later Shafi scholars. But this just shows you how strict the man was. He was so strict, in fact, that Imam al-Shadili, a person who says that, who relates dreams in which he sees Abu Hamid Al Ghazali with the prophets, because there's a dream that he relates that he saw the prophets were gathered around, and Musa alayhi salam asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "Is it true that your scholars resemble the prophets of the Israelites?" And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Yes, call Abu Hamid Al Ghazali." And so he called Abu Hamid Al Ghazali. The entire story is on YouTube, you can find it. So Imam Shadili was such a great admirer of Imam Al Ghazali, but even he had to say, he's a bit too strict. And so most Sufis are not as strict as Imam Al Ghazali, but Imam Al Ghazali was extremely strict when it came to following the laws of Islam in both the Dahir and the Batin. And so his legacy is, perhaps he's the greatest scholar in Islamic history without a doubt. He might not be the best in terms of Kalam, because there was greater works of Kalam written after him. He might not be the best in fiqh, for example. There might be better works written after him, but none of those works would have been written unless it was for Abu Hamid Al Ghazali. So that is our introduction to the life of Abu Hamid Al Ghazali. And now I will take your questions, inshallah ta'ala, if you guys have any questions. I wanted this to be like 40 minutes, but it went on for like 1 hour, 30 minutes. Let's see if there are any questions in the chat. Wa alaikum assalam to everybody who sent a salam. Imam Al Ghazali's jinn students. I'll tell you like an incident that Imam Al Ghazali relates, that once he needed a book, and the book was at some other part of, let's say, the Muslim world. And so what he did was that he had a student or a friend who was a jinn, and so he sent that jinn to that part of the world to bring the book. He read the book and then he sent the book back. So that's an interesting story for you. Jazakallah khair. So guys, any questions, inshallah ta'ala? In the group, you guys were saying, we want to ask questions. Now's your time. Or is it the case that I did a presentation so good that you have no questions? That's a good question. So in terms of the relationship, Ibn Arabi really loves Imam Al-Ghazali. So that much is very clear. So how do I explain this? So it's very clear that Imam Al-Ghazali was not an Akbarian, because obviously Imam Ghazali was born well before Ibn Arabi was born. He died well before Ibn Arabi was even born. But when you read the works of Imam Al-Ghazali, Ihya Ulum, even Mishkat al-Anwar, right, and you read his more so mystical treatises, it's very clear that Imam Al-Ghazali is on the Sufi path of the early Sufia, such as Abu Qasim al-Junayd. And I've done a video on the mystical views of Abu Qasim al-Junayd, which you can watch on my channel. So it's very clear that Imam Al-Ghazali is a dualist. So he's not a monist, or he doesn't have this quasi-monist metaphysics. So the Akbarians are not monists either, but they are neither dualists nor monists. They have something more so in the middle. But Imam Al-Ghazali is a very clear dualist. It's very clear. So, and his metaphysical system is completely different to the metaphysical system of Ibn Arabi. And so it's very clear he's not an Akbarian. And it's very clear that his metaphysics is very different to the metaphysics of Ibn al-Arabi. But there is one thing that is very true, which is that Ibn al-Arabi considers him a great sheikh. So actually, let me pull out some of the comments that Sheikh Al Akbar Ibn Arabi has made on Abu Hamid Al Ghazali. And so, like we can say, I can show you how much love he has for Abu Hamid Al Ghazali. And so, let me just bring them out. Give me a moment. Okay, where are they? So Ibn Arabi writes in Ruh al-Qudus, he was an imam regarding Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. He was an imam, a true scholar, a master of investigation, and among the people of unveiling, Ahl al-Kashf. He followed the way of taste, doh, and unveiling until he reached its utmost extent. May Allah have mercy upon him. And he writes in his letter to Fakhruddin al-Razi, he says, "Accept our Ustad, Abu Hamid, for he is with us in this issue." So he was talking some issue and he quoted Abu Hamid Al Ghazali in it. And throughout the Fatuhat, he uses Ihya Ulum very liberally. So he uses it a lot. But Sheikh Al Akbar Ibn Arabi, and I've elucidated on this on a stream that I did with Sher Shah Khan and Shees. So you can watch that stream. But I've elucidated that there is a difference between early Sufism and the Sufism of Ibn Arabi and the Sufism of Sohrawardi, because the Sufism of Ibn Arabi and Sohrawardi is influenced by the ancients, whereas the early Sufism is not influenced by the ancients. It's purely Islamic. So, but I will not go into like more detail on that because it's a very far-reading topic. Wa alaikum. What is going to be the reading pattern for everyone? The targets and the individual reading, or the weekly, monthly target? So, what we will do with the reading is that we could try to make it streamlined in the sense that, for example, the next live, which hopefully, inshallah, we will do next week on Thursday at 10 p.m. We will take 10 names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I will give an introduction to Al-Maqsad Al-Asna, and then we will go through the first 10 names that Imam Al-Ghazali gives an explanation of, and that would be the presentation. Now, what I was thinking that what we could do is that, obviously I'm going to give the presentation, everyone can read the names, it's fine, but how do you relate to those names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your life, and how do you think that the lessons that you have derived from those names can impact, let's say, positively a Muslim's life in modernity? So that was what I was thinking that we should do. But I'm open to ideas. You guys can suggest whatever you want, inshallah. So I have seen comparisons between Al-Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah. Like, are they both similar in terms of their genius and new ideas? Also, what do you think about Ajitsu's views on Sufism? So, number one, on Ibn Taymiyyah and Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, well, they are similar in some capacity, but they are very different in others. So, firstly, Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali was an Ashri. Ibn Taymiyyah was an Athari, and he was like his own kind of Athari. So he wasn't the Athari kind like Imam Ibn Qudama. So Hafiz Ibn Taymiyyah was a different kind of Athari. But he was an Athari. He was opposed to the Ash'aris, and Imam Ghazali was an Ash'ari. And so apart from that, he was not a Sufi, Ibn Taymiyyah. So Ibn Taymiyyah, actually, most people don't know this, but Ibn Taymiyyah has entire treatises in which he defends the Sufis. So he defends the entire idea of Kashf, unveiling. He defends Karama of the Sufiya. So he even writes some of the Karama that he has seen of the Sufiya. And so he defends the Karama of the Sufiya. He defends the Turuq. So he defends the Tariqas, like the Qadri Tariqa. So he was a Qadri himself. And so he defends the Sufis throughout his works. And so he has works like praising, well, not works, but treatises praising like Abu Qasim al-Junayd, praising Hassan al-Basri. But his theology is very different to Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, and he was not a Sufi. So, but they are similar in the sense that both of them are not conformists, for example, and they are very stern on whatever opinion they follow. So that is where you can find, let's say, a commonality between the two. But apart from that, they are like different. He's also a Hanbali. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali is a Shafi. So, and what do I think about Azutsi. Sorry, it's been a long stream, guys. So Azutsu's views on Sufism. So I've actually read all of the works that Azutsu has written on Sufism. So it's Sufism and Taoism, and timeless order of things, ethical concept of the Quran. So stuff like that. I believe the books are over here as well. Um, yeah, ethno. Ethico-religious concept in the Quran by Zutsu. Then I've read his Sufism and Taoism. I've read his what's the other one? Timeless Order of Things or Creation, something like that. So I've read all of those books. I think Zutsu is perhaps one of the best modern scholars that you can read on Sufism. So there are some claims that he died as a Muslim. I don't know if he did or not, but there's no doubt that he understands, let's say, the Akbarian systems. So he understands the Akbarian metaphysics. That much is clear, and so he writes very good works on it. But my personal view is that Sheikh Al-Atas is better than Azutsu because he was actually a student of Azutsu. I should have the book of Sheikh Al-Atas over here. Wait. Yep. So two of the best texts to understand like Ibn Arabi's philosophy, or not philosophy, but Ibn Arabi's metaphysics, is firstly Sufism and Taoism by Azutsu, and then this. So the Prolegomena to the Metaphysics of Islam by Sheikh Al-Atas. And so these two works are works that I found very beneficial in understanding, let's say, the metaphysics of Ibn Arabi. And so, yeah, I think that Azutsu is a great scholar. There's no doubt about that. And he understands what he writes. How to get added in the reading group? Yeah, so go to my channel, and in my channel, you will find in the links given that there's a Discord channel which link is given. So enter that Discord channel. We have the club over there. I have to say about Tasawwur. The Naqshbandi have Fana fil Sheikh, Fana fil Quran, Fana fil Allah. So we can integrate his metaphysics into the process of. So Imam Al Ghazali has treatises on Fana. So he has treatises on Fana in both Ihya Ulum and in what's the other name? Arba'in fi Sulutin. He also talks about Fana in Mishkat Al Anwar. And he also talks about the relationship between the Sufi and his Sheikh in Riyadat al Nafs. And so I've actually covered all of this. So I've covered the relationship with the Sufi and his master in on Twitter and on my channel. And his concept of Fana, I have a separate video on Fana, which you can watch. And I also cover Fana in the documentary on Abu Qasim al-Junaid. And so Imam al-Ghazali doesn't really, give very detailed specifics on many of his concepts. So, but he gives like a very basic early Sufi rendition of it. So he talks about how the Sheikh is the one who guides the pupil, how he is the one who's supposed to interpret the experience for the pupil. And he also gives maratib of Fana, just like Abu Qasim al-Junaid. So Imam al-Ghazali is early Sufi. So with Imam al-Ghazali, you should know that Imam al-Ghazali does not dive into, and he actually believed this to be a huge mistake, which is telling of experiences and explaining them. Because as we gave the analogy, if you remember in the stream previously, of the blind man, that if you were to tell the blind man of, why do I have so many books on me? So if you were to tell the blind man of, let's say, the color red, the blind man would get an idea of everything apart from the color red, right? And so that was the view of Imam Ghazali. You should never tell of your experience, because the only thing that it would do is that it would delude people, because people can't know this unless they experience it. And if you're telling them your experience, the only conclusion that they would arrive at is of something that is not the experience, right? Leading to heresies or whatsoever. And so he was very much so against it. So he didn't dive into like specifics. But actually, when you talk about like Naqshbandiya, I actually do think that it's very probable that Imam al-Ghazali was a Naqshbandi. So there are some reports that we have. They are weak, but there are reports that his Sheikh was Naqshbandi, the person who he gave bayt to. And many of the Naqshbandis claim him. So for example, Imam Rabbani, Mujaddad al-Fasani, Ahmad Sarhindi, he claims Imam Ghazali was a Naqshbandi, and he takes it from Imam Ghazali a lot in his books. So, brother, I think this time is very good. Don't change it. Oh, inshallah, inshallah. So we did a vote on the group, and so the two times that were voted either 8 p.m. or 10 p.m. So I'm fine with either. I can't do this on weekends, so I'm busy on weekends. And on Friday, I'm doing like a class, or not a class, but I'm actually aiding a brother who's doing a class on Ihya Ulum by Imam Al Ghazali. So I'm not free on Fridays as well, but Monday, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, I can take out time during this period, inshallah. Ameen, my brother. Ameen, my brother. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do the same thing for you and your family. Ameen. Can we start Arba'in fi Suludin? Yes, we will start Arba'in fi Suludin. So the way that we are going about this is that we're going to start two books. So Maqsad al-Asna, which is regarding the 99 names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we're going to start Arba'in fi Suludin. So on one stream in 1 week, we're going to have Al-Maqsad al-Asna, and on the other stream in the next week, we're going to have Arba'in fi Suludin. So we're going to cover both of them at the same time. So 2 weeks from now, we're going to be starting with Arba'in fi Suludin, inshallah. Would you believe, based on what you read about Imam Al-Ghazali, that he was a Naqshbandi? Yes, I would believe that. Yes, because he was a dualist. Well, Naqshbandis, everyone was a dualist early on. It was only later on, due to Sohrawardi and Ibn Arabi's influence, that a more so like different concept of Sufism started emerging, or let's say a different metaphysics of it started emerging. But apart from that, yeah, the thing with the Sufis is that in their basic principles, everyone is the same. So everyone agrees on what Abu Hamid Al Ghazali says, right? This is why that it is called Ghazalian Sufism, right? And it is integrated into many of the turuq, not only the Naqshbandis, but many of the turuqs have like a Ghazali and Sufi feel to it, because Imam Ghazali's Sufism is basic. It's basic and it's also general. So he doesn't dive into. So Imam Al-Ghazali, for example, wouldn't tell you what an Abdal is. He won't tell you what a Qutb is. He won't tell you many of these different, let's say, maratib of the Sufiya, because he's not interested in that. He's talking about practical religion, and at maximum, he has some treatises on more of his, let's say, mystical views. And so therefore his Sufism can be integrated with any of the turuq, right? And so that's why he could be, well, he probably was like Naqshbandi, or like, let's say, a precursor to the Sohrawardiya tariqa, but that's about it. Because the Shadili way, for example, is different to Imam Al-Ghazali's. So he can't be a Shadili, even though the founder of the Shadili tariqa absolutely loved Imam Al-Ghazali, which is Imam Shadili. But it's very clear that his viewpoints, obviously they are reconcilable, but they are not the same as like the Shadili tariqa. So either like Sohrawardiya or Naqshbandiya. Yes, absolutely. Like in Riyadat al-Nafs, by the way, brother, since like someone asked about Sufi, so like the Sheikh. So Imam al-Ghazali gives why you need a Sheikh in like Riyadat al-Nafs. He also says like the qualities that you are supposed to look at a Sheikh in Ihya Ulum, but like the main reason for why you need a Sheikh, and what are the veils that the Sheikh removes from you, and what are the protections that the Sheikh gives you in the path towards God, and in Saluk and in Zohd. He talks about all of that in Riyadat al-Nafs. So a sheikh is very important if you're going beyond practical religion. So as far as it relates to Arba'in fi Suludin and Ihya Ulumuddin, you can do all of that without a sheikh. You don't need a sheikh for that. So you don't need a sheikh for inner purity. But you do need a sheikh if you're doing, let's say you want to do saluk, so you want to do wayfaring or seclusion. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yes, having a teacher is a great. Is it necessary to read Plato or Aristotle before starting the so-called Islamic philosophy? So, like, you should read Aristotle and Plato anyway, even if it's not necessary. So, if you're into philosophy, you should read both of them, right? So, especially if you're interested in reading the Islamic Neoplatonists, So like Ibn Sina, Farabi, then you should definitely read Aristotle, right? Because they take from Aristotle. So like Ibn Sina is a bit different than the rest, so that he blends different ideas. He takes a lot from the Mutakallimin as well, but he's a bit different. But apart from even though he's a bit different, it's not like Ibn Sina invented something. So Ibn Sina was also largely influenced by the Greeks, and but he was less so. He also had a lot of original ideas. That is also true. But apart from that, even with Ibn Sina, most of his ideas are like Neoplatonist. So you should read the Greeks if you want to read that side of, let's say, Muslim intellectual history. Uh, but if you are interested in like Ilm al Kalam, then you don't need to read Aristotle or Plato. But it would still be better if you did, right? Hmm. So, like in terms of the translations of Ihya Ulumuddin, so I'll actually show you guys the ones that I've been using. So, if you guys want, you can actually, there's some books over here instead of me like ruining my library. Let's so. Uh, So this is by Eric Ormsby, and this is a very good translation. So this is of Imam Al Ghazali on love, contentment, and love, intimacy, longing, and contentment. And so it's by this author, and then you have. So this is on book Halal wal Haram, and yeah. So and then I'll show you one more, so you can get a gist of it. TJ Winter. Right. So, and then obviously, the best translation probably that you will find of some book of the Ihya is the translation done by T.J. Winter. So he's the best in my experience, right? So he also did the great translation of Riyadat al-Nafs, right? So this is a great translation. And so the best are by T.J. Winter, but most of the ones by like this publisher. So most of these translations are fine. There's nothing wrong that I found with them. So in case, would you please recommend books, secondary texts on Plato and Aristotle? So I've actually not read a lot on Plato and Aristotle, but I'll tell you what I've read on Aristotle. So I've read his politics, I've read his metaphysics, and I've read his ethics. So those are the three works of Aristotle that I've read. Apart from that, obviously, I've read some articles and stuff like that. On Plato, I've read his Republic. I've read another few works of Plato. So, okay, I messed up my library. Just give me a moment. Yeah, so in terms of Plato, so I've read the Republic on Plato. Oh my God. Yeah, so with Plato, I've read his Republic. I've read Pythagoras and Plato. I've read his, I think, Dialogues of Socrates. That's also by Plato. And so I've read that as well, but that's the extent of it. I've read the main work of Plotinus, for example, and I've read the works of some works of Proclus, and that's like the extent of my Greek reading. So for you, like for some people, that may be a lot, but for people who know that's not a lot in terms of the Greeks. Yeah, laughing at my suffering, huh? I don't. I think I broke it. Yeah, I broke it. Astaghfirullah. Yep, he is definitely one of the best, without a doubt. I'll actually show this one because he is one of the best. There is no doubt about that. Hmm. Okay, please make a video regarding Ihya consecutively. So I've actually done bits of Ihya on the channel. So I've covered parts of Ihya on the channel. And so you can watch those videos of mine, and so you can get like a better measure of some of the views of Imam Al-Ghazali from Ihya Ulumuddin. So for example, I've done an article in which I've covered like the basic metaphysical. So since we were talking about the difference of, let's say, Ibn Arabi and Abu Hamid Al Ghazali in their metaphysics, so I've actually done an article on this. So the article is what was the publisher? Traversing Tradition, yeah. So I've done the article on Traversing Tradition. It's called The Journey of the Wayfarers. So I give the basic journey of man in the Sufi view. I also covered the basic metaphysics of Imam Al Ghazali, which is largely taken from Ajaib al Qalb, the marvels of the heart, from Ihya Ulumuddin, and Riyad al Nafs from Ihya Ulumuddin, and I believe some other parts of Ihya Ulumuddin as well. And so it's also the same metaphysics that he gives in Dhikr al Maut. And so you can read that article. Apart from that, I've done a video on like the four faculties of Imam Al Ghazali, which is taken from Riyad al Nafs, and you can read that as well, inshallah. Yeah, Mulana Fazlul Kareem's translation is not good. Do not read that. Very bad. And it's not even a translation, it's more so like an abridgment. So don't read that. I don't recommend it whatsoever. It's better for you to get like these singular books. So if you guys are from Pakistan, all of these books that I have, you can find them on readings. So like readings.pk online, you can find all of these books over there. So it's better for you to just get these books, even though they might cost a bit more. But like these would cost you like 800 rupees, 900 rupees per piece. And so this is like an entire kitab from Ihya Ulumuddin. So I would recommend that personally, and so it's up to you. How to read one by one? You just pick up Ihya, my brother, and you start reading. So Imam Al Ghazali actually wrote it to be written, to be like read consecutively. So he starts with the first chapter is on knowledge, then he goes on to like basic pillars of the religion, and so what if you haven't read Imam Al Ghazali before, then you don't start with Ihya. So Ihya is not, so it's not really that difficult of a book, but some parts of it are something that will shake you. So it's better for you to start with Ihya al Walad. So the basic, let's say, starting pack that I will give with Imam al Ghazali is Ihya al Walad, Bidayatul Hidayah, Arba'in fi Suluddin, Nasiyatul Maluk, Al Maqsad al Asna, and then Ihya al Umuddin. So if you like, and you should probably also read Al Iqtisad with that. So somewhere over there. Yeah. So the stream has almost gone on for 2 hours. So do you guys have any other questions, inshallah, before we make our New Year's resolutions? No, they don't cover the whole of it. So you can find some books that are not by this publisher. So you will find some translations in ghazali.org. So for example, Ajaib al-Qalb, the marvels of the heart, you will find a translation of it on what do you call it, ghazali.org. And so it's not a great translation, but yeah, it suffices. Good to see you through too, my brother Abbas Hussain. So you can read Minhaj al-Abidin before Ihya, but the only problem is that Minhaj al-Abidin is not by Imam al-Ghazali. So it's not, it's actually, it's a false attribution. So Minhaj al-Abidin is actually a great book. So it's accepted. So the book is accepted in our scholarship, but it's not written by Imam al-Ghazali. So yeah. Yeah, it's not by Imam Ghazali. So it's an accepted book. Wait, and just like that, the light went away. So wait, so just to give you guys something to see, I'm just gonna put on the stage. And load shedding in Pakistan, mashallah. But yeah, I think that's our cue to end this. But anyways, yeah, Minhaj al-Abidin is not by Imam al-Ghazali. So it's a false attribution. Now, in terms of Farhan Bhai, I will show you my hair, inshallah, in a couple of months. Actually, there you go. I took off my cap. I showed you my hair. You can't see it. So I showed you. What amount of philosophy should a layperson learn? So, if you're a layperson, what you should do is that you should read like basic books of Ashari Kalam or Maturidi Kalam. So I'll tell you some works. So the works that you should read is the works you should read are, you should start with Bado Amali, a good translation of it, and then you should also read Kharida al Bahiyya. There's a good translation of it online by a brother named Karkoshi, which you should read. Then you should move on to Johara Tawheed and the Sanusi Creed. Then you're going to move on to Al Iqtisad. And for most individuals, this is enough. If you want to do more than that, then you can read something like Al Irshad after that, and then Sharul Aqaid al Nasafiya by Imam Tastazani. But for most people, that would be enough. If you want to read more than that, then you should learn Arabic and read Imam al Razi. Yeah. Okay. Was he a leading? Imam Ghazali is a mujtahid mutlaq. So Imam Ghazali is the biggest level of scholar that you can imagine. So Imam Al Ghazali is a bigger authority. So he's not a bigger authority than Imam Nawawi, but that's because Imam Nawawi is a verifier, right? So Imam Nawawi is a verifier of the Shafi'i school, so that's why he's a bigger authority than Imam Ghazali. But in terms of personal, let's say, jurisprudential levels, Imam Ghazali is a bigger scholar than Imam Nawawi. He's a bigger scholar than all of them, to be frank. And so he's the biggest authority. Now, in terms of music, many of the Shafi'i scholars accept Imam Ghazali's fatwa. Some of them have a fatwa that is even more lenient than Imam al-Ghazali. So it is a minority view. All of the ulama held some minority view, so it's not really an issue. In terms of his fatwa on Ibn Sina, most of the Islamic scholars during his period accepted the fatwa. It is in the later period that some of the scholars do not accept his fatwa on Ibn Sina, but during his time, almost everybody accepted it. So it's not like he did a mistake. And I am inclined to favor the fatwa actually. So even though I do not make I do not call Ibn Sina, you know what, but I am inclined. If I was to take a position, then I am more inclined to the fatwa of Imam Ghazali. Yeah. I can't disagree. I think that is very clear. I'm working on Arabic. Yeah, that is what you should be doing. So, like the best thing you can do for yourself in your learning of Islam is that learn Arabic. Learn Arabic. There is no bigger thing that you can do, inshallah. Okay, so guys, load shedding is done. You can't even see my face anymore. You're seeing my canvas screen. So I think it's about time we end this, inshallah ta'ala. So we will gather again next week, this time, inshallah, this time or 10 p.m., whichever suits you. And we will start with Al-Maqsad Al-Asna. So it was a pleasure having all of you over here. Now this video will be recorded. So if some of you missed, let's say, the first part of it, or you missed some part of it, or you want to return to some part of it, this video will be on my channel and you can rewatch it as many times as you please. So with that said, it was a pleasure and an honor to present and to do an introduction on Abu Hamid Al Ghazali in front of all of you. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from me and may He accept from you. Every single fault that I have uttered in this live stream is from my own, and every single beneficial word is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All good is only His property. With that, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And I'll see you next time. Stay faithful, stay praying, and we'll meet next week. Okay, bye bye, guys.